Context situates everything. Context is not just the background. Context is the evidence. It tells us what kind of institution it is, what is its legal framework, what are its political constraints, what is the socio-economic profile of the electorate, what is the demographic profile of the electorate, where does this particular country sit on the spectrum of democratic consolidation, and how does this case connect to the sustainable development goals, especially peaceful, just, and inclusive institutions. The context focuses very deeply and scientifically on the conditions and on the operating environment. So while discussing the context, you need to go deeper than what things may appear superficially. Because it is possible that there are two cases of similar solutions to similar problems. But in these two cases of similar solutions to similar problems, it is possible that the conditions that made those solutions successful in these two different situations, these two different contexts were different. Same problem, same solution, but the conditions which made them successful in two situations may be different. For example, an election held in an established federal democracy is fundamentally different. The institutional arrangement is fundamentally different. Institutional environment is fundamentally different than election held in a post-conflict transitional state. The second step is the problem statement of the problem, which we need to identify with precision. Precision means it cannot be stated in a very generalized manner. For instance, low voter turnout. This is not a problem. Low voter turnout. This is not how you document the problem. The problem is much more detailed. Which eligible voters were systematically excluded? Through what structural mechanisms? And with what measurable consequences? Consequences for the legitimacy of the institutions. Therefore, the sharpness of the problem statement is very important, because this is what determines whether the case will generate useful lessons for others, or it will remain pleasant, eloquent discussion or description. The third step is intervention. What kind of interventions were made? What kind of reforms were undertaken? The practices or innovations. These have to be stated with a sufficient depth as well as clarity. So that, because this is the important idea or important visualization, that as authors of the reports, the researchers must have in the background of their mind that who will read those reports. Whether those people, election officials, election management bodies who will read those reports would be able to understand and apply them to their situations, to their circumstances and contexts. So you have to ask yourself whether a practitioner reading the case would be able to understand it. So when we are discussing an intervention, a reform, a policy, it is not sufficient to say or to state that, for example, a voter education campaign was launched. A voter education campaign was launched. This is inadequate because what we need to explain in this section of intervention, what was the content of the campaign, how it was delivered, through what channels, targeting which populations, with what messages, designed by whom, and authorized under what legal framework. So you see it in every step, what we are focusing on, what we are actually targeting is the depth and detail. Because sometimes, superficially, things are different, but devil lies in the details. And researchers must not miss those details. If those details are missed, then you can possibly report an entirely different picture. Fourth is the implementation design, which is where most case studies fall into vagueness, collapse into vagueness. This element must describe the full choreography of the reform. Who were the key actors? What sequencing was followed? What resources, financial, human, technological, were deployed? What training was provided to the staff, to the frontline staff? What oversight mechanisms existed? And what happened when something went wrong? The implementation science is very clear on this. Just by knowing that a particular intervention has worked well in certain context or certain circumstances, without making it clear in your report that how exactly it was implemented, will be useless for anyone who wants to replicate that reform. The fifth component of case documentation is the documentation of results. As we have discussed in all the steps, the results must be rigorously documented. A researcher should differentiate between outcomes and intentions. Between outcomes and intentions. It is possible that policy intentions were very good, but there were unintended outcomes. Despite good intentions, there can be bad outcomes. And researchers should identify the causal mechanisms that led to those outcomes. Policy was made for a very good purpose. It had even a very good design, great ambition. But on the ground, when it was implemented, the outcomes were unexpected. So that thing needs to be understood by a researcher and needs to be explained in the report, the causal mechanism. Documenting results or outcomes means telling what actually changed, for whom, by how much, over what time frame and with what consequences. The most honest and most useful case studies are one that report not only successes but also failures. A good report must also report failures, must also report surprises, and must also report, as I said, unanticipated and unintended consequences. The sixth step and the sixth point is the evidence base. This is a confidence building measure. When a reader knows that this particular researcher or this group of researchers, they have undertaken very serious and extensive research, they are more likely to have faith in those findings. So we need to explain how we have collected the evidence and what is the quality and the nature of the evidence, whether it was systematic evaluation, whether it was administrative data review, whether it was a stakeholder survey, whether it was expert observation or perception survey data. Because each evidence type that you mention in your research design will have different levels of confidence. And each method will have different vulnerabilities to bias. In each and every methodology, each and every design, you can never be 100% sure. There will be some limitations, some possibilities that whatever finding, even if it is based on rigorous data collection, may have some bias, because the data collection process, making the data collection process completely bias free, can be very challenging, as we were discussing the previous day, on the first day. So, because this is important, because a reader in another country, an official election management body, they have to evaluate whether to adopt this particular policy, this particular reform, this particular best practice, this particular model standard or not. So therefore, they need to know the quality of evidence, which is our responsibility to explain in our reports. Seventh is the lessons. The lessons are scientific propositions and not eye-catching slogans. These are not compliments, but lessons are a compass. So these must be stated very clearly and very objectively. For instance, if we say that reform succeeded because of strong political will, reform succeeded because of team effort, team was very sincere, team was motivated, team was committed. This is not the lesson. Stating this is inadequate, because a lesson must be specific, conditional, along with conditions, and actionable. The lesson must explain what was done, what changed, under what conditions these lessons are applicable. Finally, our case documentation should be, which is very important, transferable. Transferability, when you try to ensure transferability, you ask, because this is what I am providing you is basically a list of questions for each and every step. When you develop, once you have the data, you have done the analysis, comparative analysis there, your understanding is very clear. Now, report writing is sometimes a challenge. I've seen researchers who have very high quality, good quality data, everything is there. But when it comes to report writing, that means writing the research paper, then they falter, and the results are reported in a way which is inadequate, and several things remain unaddressed. So that is what we are doing. So transferability asks, what would another country, another election management body need to know? What another country need to have in place before attempting this particular reform? The OECD guidance on best practice transfer specify that we must examine alignment process. Our report should specify, along with a successful intervention, the needs of the community where that particular intervention was successful, workforce capacity, regulatory environment, infrastructure, political priorities, stakeholder support, and operational capacity. Implementation research adds that the key question is not whether two contexts look similar on surface, but whether population characteristics, intervention logic, operational conditions, and transfer processes are sufficiently aligned. With the conditions prevailing in that particular context or country, so that the reform or the policy can function in the new context or new setting. So this 8-element architecture is what separates our IIIDEM study from a press release. So this is not clerical work. This is not documentation for its own sake. What we are trying to achieve, what we are trying to attempt in our outcomes is a complete democratic statecraft. Thank you very much. All of you have access to this PPT? Huh?
Sir, we will share. Thank you so much, sir, for your valuable insights. The floor is now open for questions.
Thank you, Chanchalji. I have a question which may not make much sense to officials here, but those of us who do research perhaps know this and perhaps face this problem, particularly when doing case studies. And thinking of case studies, many a times, and as you also I think hinted, many a times a practice which might become a good practice in a specific situation might be interpreted as a bad practice in another situation. So how, and at the end of the day, it is a researcher who's going to write the report. So how does one navigate the possibilities of value judgments in looking at case studies? I mean, just to give you an example for the strand that we are looking into. So let's look into ballot access, or let's look into the case of political parties. Now, different countries would have different systems of looking and describing political parties. In our case, it's a very quantitative kind of an understanding of what a national party would be, what a regional party would be, and that you know, such a large number of EMBs and their practices being different, how do we have a understanding of a standardized understanding of what can be seen as a case study?
That is what basically we have described in our documents also, which were shared previously. Case study is obviously always context specific, and it can also give this illusion of universal application, that it is universal. Because the case study is written and designed in such a way. But if you have understood the process completely in terms of how to write a scientific case study report, it is very clear that what is legal in one particular context can always be, this possibility is there, can be unconstitutional in some other context. So these are the small details which is your responsibility as the researcher and author to mention it in the report, so that the reader understand that my country's constitutional context is different. And even if the constitutional context is same, even then there could be some other challenges, political, economic, institutional, social. So our responsibility is not to convince the election management bodies across the world that this is the policy, this is the practice, this is the model you have to or you can adopt in order to bring the kind of outcomes or results which it brought about in certain specific context. Because along with that, you will mention all those operating environment conditions which would make it very clear that under what circumstances, under what conditions, in what historical juncture that particular reform or the policy led to some kind of good results. So once you make it very clear, anyone who reads that report will be able to understand that if this kind of an outcome is needed, what kind of adjustments I need to make. Policymakers can then understand it, what kind of adjustments are required so that this particular outcome can be replicated in my context. So this is in the, everything lies in the design of the how
Would
you.
you also suggest then perhaps putting some caveats to start with, so that and mentioning exactly what you're saying, that this is situation specific and may or may not apply to others?
Yes, this is the basic design of the case study. It is always context specific, it is always situation specific. It is for the others to see what we can do, how we can adapt, what to add, what to change. These are the actually very interesting examples how some kind of people's problems were solved in certain context. It is not necessary that similar problems in our context will be solved by similar solutions. Many things can go wrong.
So that indicates that it is a directly proportional, case documentation is directly proportional to the case specific with the riders. Like it has to be particular in that particular situation, environment, socio-economic factor and all other factors which is dependent and independent variables. That
Yes.
is how we have to carry out that.
Yes,
And
because
very rightly